Humans are collective community-seeking creatures, but when we are pitted against each other, it's very easy to fall into this, "Oh, well, I only wanna protect my own." It helps, certain people for us to fight each other versus fighting them.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our final video essay of the year here at The Financial Diet. And we thought long and hard about the topic that we wanted to cover to close out the year, especially in light of our two previous video essays, the sister episodes on consumer culture and convenience culture, which you guys really loved. At least I mean, most of you loved it. I mean, you don't have to come in the comments and clarify if you didn't. And when we looked at the concept of both convenience and consumerism, it's very clear in looking at the data that they are often just symptoms of a greater underlying problem. And in America, often the underlying problem that leads to so many horrendous manifestations in our finances and lives is one of scarcity. Now, people talk about scarcity in terms of personal finance often as a mindset or way of perceiving money, and that's true, and we'll talk about it. But I think it's important to take a step back and think about how capitalism as a concept is really founded and built on scarcity. And it should be noted that especially in the context of an economy as rich and productive as ours is, which experiences as high levels of income inequality and poverty as we do, often that scarcity is completely manufactured. We could afford for everyone to be living at a much higher quality of life. We just don't allocate the money that way, because it is also built on competition. Everywhere you look in American culture, you see winners and losers.
Worst presentation ever. I'm out.
Oh, that was mean.
I ask the questions, you give the answers.
That shit, dog.
Sick of just words. Talk. Shut the up. Just do it. Just stop talking and do it.
I had to get rid of my biggest strategic threat. Who's you?
So if you want to fire me, go right ahead.
All right, Gene,
but I think
you're fired. We're going to decline.
You're dead to me.
The home security device company Ring. It's a reported $1 billion acquisition.
Sharks. Well. Look who's back.
And in the context of a culture that prioritizes competition above all else and leaves so many people without enough, it's totally natural that many of us as a result would develop a kind of scarcity mindset. The term scarcity mindset was originally coined to describe a specific type of anxiety and cognitive stress experienced by people whose incomes are below the federal poverty threshold. In a 2017 experiment, researchers found that the distress over not having enough money or resources to get by had a negative effect on people's mental state. But how? Well, ultimately, they suggested that someone's hyperfixation or worry over what they lack could lead to poor decision-making and higher stress, as a mindset encourages us to focus on what we don't have or what others have, rather than what we do. And it's not just the overarching context of competition and often the winner-take-all results of capitalism that put us in this mindset, it's also the marketing that we are constantly surrounded by. Because marketing in one way or another is often also preying on that concept of scarcity. For example, things like sales and seasonality and limited stock are all ways of manufacturing urgency and timing.
We wish you a happy Honda day for a happier new year.
'Tis the time to see the 2006 Honda Pilot.
The Target 2-day sale starts Friday, November 26th at 4 a.m.
Everything's on sale during Christmas in July.
And with how technology has enabled us to shop in a seamless and instantaneous way, something we talked about a lot in our convenience video, the ways to exploit and enhance this sense of scarcity and urgency have exploded. One really famous example that the sneakerheads in this audience, which I can't imagine there's a ton of you, but I'm sure you're out there, might be familiar with, is the concept of drops. Now, there are drops of all kinds of products, but some of the best known are drops of limited edition sneakers, a marketing strategy that has been made iconic by sneaker legends such as Nike. Quote, Nike releases limited stock and limited edition shoes with its Sneakers app. The limited stock inspires customers to get ready in the app minutes ahead of time to make sure that they join the queue exactly when it opens to maximize their chances of getting a shoe. Nike has said that entries are selected randomly based on the availability of a shoe size, hinting that it might be more of a random lottery than a matter of who is in line first. But despite this, the scarcity principle is in play here, so much so that people have built specialized bots to monitor the website and immediately enter buyer information when the timer goes off. And as someone who was recently scammed by StubHub, and I won't play the whole thing, I'm not going to bore you with it, but I do have a story on my TikTok of exactly what happened. And as of filming this, I got a word from them 3 weeks ago that they finally capitulated and said that they would refund my money. Still hasn't hit my bank account. I'm still calling StubHub every other day. I swear to God, I need to live long enough to see the end of StubHub. All those companies, all of those scalping companies, third-party reselling companies are truly the bane of my existence. But it cannot be stressed enough that that entire model of immediately buying up all of the inventory and then reselling it, all of this is just another way to manufacture urgency and scarcity and then capitalize off of it. And here's the thing, I took my husband to go see a Formula One race for our anniversary, which was like the most special thing I've ever done. I'm certainly not a Formula One person, but it's like his favorite thing in the world. And the fact that they tarnished our whole anniversary trip with the, I'm not exaggerating, like 17 calls that I had to be on for hours at a time to try and get my money back or replacement tickets. Anyway, StubHub can burn. But I digress. Much like hyper-convenience and overconsumption, modern life traps us into a scarcity mindset on almost every front of our lives, but especially with our finances, and even when we technically have enough. So let's start there with chapter 1, the finances of feeling scarce. As I said earlier, the scarcity mindset is first and foremost a financial one. It is the opposite of an abundance mindset, wherein you look and think and act as if there will always be enough resources to go around.
To learn more about where the scarcity mindset comes from and why it's so hard for us to get rid of, we spoke with Asia Evans, financial therapist and author of Feel Good Finance.
Scarcity is definitely something that I think everyone struggles with no matter what. And it doesn't matter how much money you have or how little money you have. I still feel like the way our society and definitely America plays a role in how we think about money specifically and items is usually at a level of scarcity that there's only so much of the pie, that there's only so much certain people can do to be able to get to a position. And that is not the pull yourself up by your bootstraps rhetoric. It's just to say that it's almost bred into us that we're all fighting for pieces, and there's only but so many pieces to go around. And if your fight isn't good enough, then you don't get that. And I mean, I just disagree. Personally, I just don't think that's the case. I think that there's more than enough to go around, but the way we're handling things right now in America is not, it's not pretty. It's not easy for people to kind of share or feel like they can get out from under a bad situation.
And to be clear, in no way is this an endorsement of like The Secret or money manifesting or thinking that just because you think more abundantly, you're automatically going to generate more resources. That's also BS, just to be clear. But back to the scarcity mindset. For many people, a scarcity mindset comes from living in poverty, which is understandable. When you're worried about where your next meal is coming from, you simply can't be focused on anything else. And it's also very difficult to picture a time in which you won't be living that way. Speaking as someone who used to struggle immensely financially, part of the reason it took me so long to rehabilitate my finances was a feeling that I would never get out of debt, never not be hounded by collection services, never not having to use check cashing services, and basically just never not being caught in the cycle of not having enough money. Scarcity mindset isn't just about the money itself, it's also about the life you can envision yourself living, which often prevents you from taking the most basic steps to live a better one.
To hear a first-hand account of dealing with a scarcity mindset, we spoke with Esther, a working millennial who grew up in a religious immigrant household.
So I feel like my scarcity mindset, interestingly enough, started after I joined the workforce, after I graduated college, because I think that growing up, twofold. One, I grew up in a Korean immigrant family that was very kind of supportive of my education, did not want me to feel kind of the burden of like doing a part-time job or just focusing on my studies. And two, I grew up in a very religious community. So there was a lot of community help, especially financially, for the family, despite living in, a 2-bedroom apartment with a family of 4, my family, and then another family, and things were tight. You never felt like you were lacking because you could always ask for support. So growing up, I didn't really have that scarcity mindset, but it felt like after I graduated college and was trying to support myself, suddenly being put into this capitalistic American system, feeling very unsupported in that area and not having the tools in the toolkit to really know where to start, because my parents really did not have any savings growing up. I really had no kind of idea of what financial security meant. I kind of equated, the emotional security, and which is great, and the familial security to financial security, which is not always the case. I just felt like there's this Korean word called hyodo, which is kind of this filial piety, where your parents are going to support you, and then in turn, whether they really understand it or not, culturally, you will be giving back to them in the future out of gratitude. So I think that kind of pressure after I joined the workforce of I have to support myself, but also in the future, I'm going to have to support my family, came as a really big burden to me. And it did kind of leave me in this freeze mindset of not knowing what to do. So that's where I think the scarcity mindset began. And it was weird to kind of have that scarcity mindset as an adult, as like I felt like I wasn't a child anymore at the young 20s, but yeah, trying to live this fully autonomous life while still kind of being frantic and panicking inside.
But I would argue that scarcity mindset is particularly pervasive in Americans, even among those who are living well above the poverty line, for one big reason. Our society is so individualistic that we are taught that competition exists on every possible level, even with ourselves. And I would argue that this mentality of hyper-competitiveness and comparison is even more pervasive in wealthy communities than in low-income ones, especially when we see how the wealthy tend to self-isolate while lower-income folks have to lean into community. Quote, a recent analysis of survey data from more than 100,000 Americans finds that the rich spend significantly less time socializing than low-income Americans. On average, they spend 6.4 fewer evenings per year in social situations. We can also see very direct ties between things like lifestyle inflation and the kind of people you surround yourself with. There is a reason why as people tend to earn more, they also tend to spend more, because statistically, they are more and more socializing with people who earn about what they do. So what felt like enough before, now no longer feels like enough. And that mentality of competition means that even if something is technically good enough for you in your private life, it may not be good enough for impressing the people around you or just straight up doing better than them. In fact, I would argue that the maxim about keeping up with the Joneses is at best pretty outdated, because especially for wealthier Americans, it's more a question of outdoing them.
I think the way scarcity would definitely show up for people would be different if somebody is just having kind of a scarcity mindset versus living in scarcity. So you can have lived through scarcity and that impacts your mindset. But there's a difference between worrying about if there's going to be enough because you have lived through there not being enough, compared to somebody who may be like, hey, I've had enough and I'm worried that it won't be enough for me in the future, but I haven't lived through it. When you have lived through not having enough, that feels very different than just worrying about it. The fear of going back to not having enough is like, you feel it. It's traumatic. You can feel it in your body. You might respond to that versus it could be a worry. It could even be anxiety for somebody who hasn't lived through it, but it shows up very differently for each of the people who've had those different experiences.
And even when people have enough to, for example, invest their money in the market, a scarcity mindset can mean making bad financial decisions in bad economic times, like, for example, pulling your money out of the market when you see a drop. And acting reactively instead of proactively is a product of that scarcity mindset. And scarcity is also rampant in our buying habits. It's a hugely effective sales tactic because when we see a steep discount, for example, we are often more likely to hit the buy button. And this can lead us to make very rash spending decisions, as well as buy things that we otherwise wouldn't if there wasn't this false sense of urgency. Even on social media, which in many cases has just become a glorified shopping network, there are constant trends of influencers and creators sharing links to viral items as soon as they get restocked, usually accompanied with a reminder of how quickly they sold out the last time.
That sells out every single time I restock it here on TikTok Shop.
And as we talked about in the convenience video, things like free shipping thresholds will mean that even if you weren't going to buy a certain amount before, you'll now easily psychologically justify it to yourself to buy more than you should or need in order to get that free shipping. And this is something that we need to be very clear about. While yes, if you wait for a sale to buy an item that you were otherwise planning to buy will save you money, that is not fundamentally how sales work as a concept. If the only thing that all of these marketing tactics accomplished was to make people buy things they were otherwise going to pay full price for, businesses would never run them. But they don't. Sales exist explicitly to get people to spend more. According to Capital One's discount marketing statistics, quote, 67% of US consumers have made a purchase that they weren't planning on after being offered a discount. And online retailers report that consumers who use coupons spend 37% more than those who don't. Additionally, 47% of online shoppers will spend up to a minimum amount to qualify for free shipping. I have to say personally that the coupon example to me is one of the best examples of how a scarcity mindset or an urgency mindset can often trick us into doing the exact opposite of what we want to do. And I think it also ties in really clearly with things like the constant competition. Because in some ways, the gamification of things like sales and coupons and drops and discounts means that you're almost engaged in a kind of video game with these retailers, especially when you're shopping online.
Scarcity mindset impacts everybody in a way that it feels like survival. And again, like to the point about it doesn't matter whether you live through scarcity or not. If you feel like you are fighting for something, it leads you to make decisions that are kind of based in a survival mentality that, oh, I have to get it now. And that comes up a lot, and I'm sure we may talk about it, but in marketing, right? Like you are fighting for something. There's only but so much. We only have 10 objects left, only 10 spots, that sort of thing, that kind of marketing efforts. But when you are thinking about, hey, how is scarcity shifting what I do with my money? How is scarcity then shifting how I behave financially? It really plays a huge part, because you may feel like you always have to buy things quickly because they're not going to be there. And it just lends to this mentality of always needing things right now, potential instant gratification versus being like, oh, hey, I know it's going to be there when I come back to it, when I save the money, when I have the money, when I'm in a different position, it will be there, versus the scarcity mindset that tells you it won't.
These marketing tactics prey on people who want to feel like they are part of something more. I think we live a very individualistic life nowadays. I have a lot of friends who feel kind of disconnected with the world and their place in it, especially as we're getting into our late 20s. I was thinking about this question this Black Friday. I feel like it's interesting because I've been slowly educating myself about these systems for a while now, watching channels like TFD and like consuming kind of financial advice on either TikTok or Instagram. You feel like, oh, I'm not susceptible to like the really out there marketing tactics. I think it's the ones that are very innocuous. I trying to buy experiences for like you and a friend that you haven't seen for a while, or deals like this spa experience, for example. I wanted to treat my friend who's going through a hard time to a spa experience, and it's on Groupon, and how like it's cheaper than it usually is, and it's worth it because you can't put a price on friendships, but you're banged over the head with all of these marketing tactics all day, every day. And you can't really escape it once you like see it and you kind of chew on it a while and you're consuming more content. It's not that I wanted to have my life mirror influencers or celebrities. It's like I think that marketing has come more and more towards like, oh, we are fostering community, and I think a lot of these buzzwords about, a lot of therapy speak, this is for your mental health and your mental well-being, and when it comes in language like that, it's hard to really stop and think, like, is this really good for me financially? This kind of idea of investing in yourself, investing in your mental health, your well-being, and your community at the expense of your finances is promising that you are going to get something in return, or that you are going to be fulfilled enough that you don't have to do this again, or that once you, especially like subscriber based, like if you subscribe to, I don't know, like a newsletter, or like a subscription box, or skincare subscription box or something, it's you are paying for your time, and your time is just as your time is just as valuable as your money. And so because you're saving time, you're saving your money. But sometimes you doing things yourself, so like going to the grocery store instead of Instacart, yes, you're spending more time, but you have more agency and more control over each dollar that you spend, rather than kind of going into the convenience of it.
And this is all the more powerful when combined with our next chapter, Chapter 2, the comparison to consumption pipeline. So in our video essay about hyperconsumption, we talked about how a scarcity loop is part of what fuels that consumption. It consists of 3 parts. You start with an opportunity to get something of value, something that improves your life. In the case of a slot machine, it's money. Number 2 is that you have an unpredictable reward. You may get the thing of value at some point, but you don't know when, and you don't know exactly how valuable it will be. Social media is a huge feeder of our scarcity loop. We see an item we like and feel we must have, like a skincare product or a pair of shoes or a perfectly aesthetically overstocked fridge, and we receive unpredictable rewards. For example, whether or not the purchases improve our lives. Then we scroll and see the next item that we must have, and we repeat the process. And it's the same reason that we get sucked into scrolling social media apps. We know when we are not actively getting anything out of it, but the possibility that we could come across something of value, even just to make us laugh, keeps us sucked in. And on the flip side, there's also the very real psychological phenomenon of things being perceived as more desirable because they're more expensive. Quote, "A Veblen good is a good for which demand increases as the price increases due to its exclusive nature and appeal as a status symbol. This runs counter to the prevailing circumstance of demand falling as prices rise. Thus, a Veblen good has an upward sloping demand curve rather than the typical downward sloping curve. A Veblen good is generally a high quality, coveted product. This stands out in contrast to a Giffen good, which also has an upward sloping curve, but is a non-luxury product with no easily available substitutes." And I do want to be clear here that as a channel who often recommends that people invest in higher quality items to overall consume less and have a lower cost per use, that there is a very big difference between investing in quality that will make an item long-lasting and investing in perceived exclusivity and status. Now, I know I'm speaking from my position here as someone who essentially owns like no designer clothes or bags or shoes or whatever. It's just never personally been my thing. So some might say that I'm just being a hater because it's not my thing, and I guess I'm hating from outside the club because I don't have any fancy designer bags. But it's an objective reality that many designer products, especially those that bear the label so that everyone can see what you're wearing or what you have the power to buy, have a dollar value that is totally decoupled from the actual quality of the product. In many cases, you are explicitly just paying for that outward perception of exclusivity. And while yes, sometimes these can be much higher quality products, in almost all cases, you are also experiencing a huge markup on top of that is just about perceived scarcity. And it might seem counterintuitive, but in some ways, the sense of urgency that underpins mega sales is not that dissimilar from what drives us to purchase ultra flashy luxury items. In both cases, the message is clear. This is something rare and special, and if you don't engage with it now, you might be missing out forever. And as with all marketing, there is a distinct lack of focus on what actually holds meaning or necessity in your life, as opposed to just being driven by purely external and psychological forces.
Consumerism hurts all of us. It is not helping any of us. Listen, I want people to be more mindful and intentional about the things that they're buying. And I think that's a lot of the work that I'm trying to do, to say it's not just about how much money you have or don't have. It really is about being more intentional about what you need to do with your money and then how you can enjoy your money. But when we think about the scarcity tactics that are used, who doesn't want to make sure that they get the part of the 10 spots or make sure that they get in on something that they feel or believe is no longer going to be there? And I fall victim to it too all the time. There are times I'm like, oh God, I really should have. Listen, I wanted those Tay-Tay concert tickets as well. I didn't try to get them, but it would have been nice to be able to go to the concert. But knowing that there was only a few spots. You have to decide, hey, am I going to fight this good fight for this or not? And sometimes it's not even a fight, right? Sometimes it's not even that serious. But when we are thinking about the techniques that say it is that serious, you feel like, oh, I'm not going to be seen. I'm not going to be part of the community. I wasn't there. It lends itself to a level of FOMO that makes people want to act a little bit more seriously than they may have acted if they felt like it was always going to be there.
And our natural human drive to compare ourselves to others, which has been hugely inflated by social media, is a big part of what keeps us in that loop. Because there is a very fundamental idea that is very difficult to get rid of in humans as a rule, but especially in a hyper-competitive and individualist society like America, that if someone else has something, that means it's inherently less accessible to us. Quote, some studies estimate that as much as 10% of our thoughts are comparisons of some kind. The two major types of social comparison are upward and downward. Upward comparison occurs when you compare yourself to someone you believe is superior, and on the other hand, downward comparison means comparing yourself to someone you think is inferior. Both types of comparisons can have pros and cons. And with social media, human comparisons are more accessible than ever before. Many people tend to compare the ups rather than the downs. It can feel like there's an endless stream of perfect jobs, marriages, bodies, and houses, but this is not the case. Sometimes social media can amplify this idea of the perfect life, and that is a problem. Essentially, what social media has done is explode the number of people who can be part of this constant comparison loop. We now have essentially an unlimited number of people that we can compare ourselves to, and in many cases, because the drivers of social media are often creators and influencers who are being paid to demonstrate a certain kind of lifestyle or who are to some extent monetizing that social media, you're usually surrounded with a lot more people who are above you in perception than below you.
And I've, at this point, really been at both ends of the spectrum of being really on top of my finances. I think when I first graduated, I was really on top of things and I was really wanted to get my finances in order. And then I think after the pandemic hit and kind of being in the workforce for like 5 years now, you get a little lax and the lifestyle inflation starts and you start reacting to the societal pressures, such as I'm 29 now, you know, the pressures of settling down, owning a home, starting a family, no matter how, you know, progressive we've kind of come from those ideals. I think that is always kind of in the back of your mind, should I be hitting these milestones? And because of that pressure, I think you're definitely trying to keep up.
But it's not just the influencer living an incredibly lavish lifestyle, it is also the cult of personal news. Because it's important to note that in some cases, seeing updates from people in your life on achievements or life moments when you're not feeling particularly good in that area is only going to make you feel way worse. Especially as women, we are constantly sold on the idea that we are in competition with other women, especially as it pertains to life choices. But whether someone is announcing their big promotion, or that they're having their third child, or that they're engaged, or that they bought a home, it is just simply an unnatural amount of information to be getting on the life choices of other people. And this unspoken sense of competition that is often, frankly, what drives social media, because to be clear, things like exciting personal updates and developments are usually what will get the most engagement. We see how it feeds into a culture of competition in, for example, the workplace, where, as we've discussed on this channel before, there is often a phenomenon of people from a specific group, like, say, women, reaching the highest levels of success in various industries and decidedly not bringing up other women along with them. But speaking of women and perceived scarcity, one thing I want to really unpack when it comes to how our culture is constantly telling us that we don't have enough is in Chapter 3, Youth, the Ultimate Luxury Product. Now, one thing that we have talked about on this channel before, but always needs to be repeated because it is such a massive problem with young adults and teenagers and even now children, is a hyperfixation on youth. Things like anti-aging and preventative skincare have exploded in recent years. There is a constant obsession with celebrities, influencers, and other people in the public eye aging gracefully, aka just having more expensive and subtle procedures, which then people often refer to as aging unproblematically. And especially when you consider how youth-oriented and youth-populated the most popular social media platforms tend to be, which is where most young adults and teenagers are getting their news and media consumption, it's not shocking that we would be now more than ever absolutely obsessed with the idea that the younger we are, the better we are. And when young people are sold the idea that they're in the prime of their life and it's all downhill from there, it puts them in a scarcity mindset financially because they must take advantage of life now before those opportunities run out. This is why we saw that trend of "I'll get the money back, but I'll never be 23 in Ibiza again" videos. And on its surface, this feels like an abundance mindset. If you know you can always get the money back and saying yes to the present, you're living abundantly, right? But when these choices are made at the expense of taking care of your future self, the long-term results are sobering. So for example, let's say you're 22, making $45,000 a year, and you decide to start investing 10% of your salary into a 401k. Estimating a 3% salary increase each year, a 3% inflation rate, and 7% returns, by age 60, your 401k balance will be $1,164,898. But let's say you decide to put off your 401k contributions for a while so that you can spend more on those youthful experiences. If the above scenario is the same, but you don't start investing that 10% into your 401k until age 32 when you're making $60,000, by age 60, your 401k balance will be $677,031. And I know you might be thinking, well, those both really sound like big numbers, so what's the problem? I urge you to consider that if you want to retire in your early to mid 60s, $1 million is really not that much money. As a side note, I think one of the problems that we have, like just with our perception of finance, is that we still think of $1 million as this really huge, unattainable number, which it is in some ways, but it also prevents us from understanding that especially these little decisions on a day-to-day basis that can eventually lead up to those big numbers over a long enough period of time actually do matter, because $1 million, when you have to live on it for potentially 20 years and you want to still maintain some semblance of the lifestyle you used to, is not as much as you think. And this isn't meant to shame or scare anyone, because getting started investing late is much better than never, but missing out on crucial years of early investing, if they're available to you, can mean totally different outcomes. And to be clear, if you're in a position to be doing things like impromptu trips to Ibiza, you are probably also in a position to be saving. And if you're not, living excessively or beyond your means or putting yourself into debt is not the same thing as living abundantly. But the message that your youth is the most important time of your life is one that is constantly pushed on social media. And the chasing of youth doesn't disappear as we get older, especially for women. It just changes form. Anti-aging is no longer just a sector of beauty or skincare. It has become its own industry that's on track to be worth $93 billion by 2027. It has blossomed out of, in my opinion, the same scarcity that drives us to overdo it in our youthful FOMO pursuits, because life will give us less opportunities once we're no longer young. Once we're no longer young and beautiful. Lana, what are you doing marrying that alligator guy? So even as we get older, it's still on us to keep looking as youthful and radiant as possible. Quote, there are a lot of individual differences in how people age and how susceptible they are to external influences such as ageism and age discrimination. Candace Connert, a psychology professor at the University of Calgary who studies aging, said, it depends on who they compare themselves to, how the issue is treated amongst their families and partners, what media they consume, their mental health, and other factors. Still, the clear message across generations has been that the beauty ideal is young, thin, and toned. Where did boomer women learn about their bodies? They learned from their mothers, who were raised in the era of Mad Men. And it doesn't help that the target audience for anti-aging products just keeps getting younger and younger, meaning that these skincare companies are gaining more lifelong customers, because once you start skincare treatments, you have to keep undergoing maintenance and upkeep. New MLM, anyone?
I think in terms of kind of this youth culture and this anti-aging, being Korean and kind of consuming Korean content, it's interesting because it's not that you're, missing out if you don't participate in like buying that anti-aging serum or that moisturizer or that retinol serum. It's that you are looking after yourself, your inner beauty and your outer beauty. And if you're doing that, you are going to feel good about yourself, and you are also contributing to the economy, contributing to community, commiserating with other people who have these same concerns. It's not just you that's feeling this. We are all feeling the weight of the patriarchy and being old hags one day.
Not to mention, it is not cheap. Even creams that you can find in the pharmacy aisle are pricey. The relatively basic suite of skincare products sitting in my bathroom cabinet right now cost me more than $100 to acquire. And one survey found that women will spend some $225,000 on their appearances across their lifetime, with a quarter of that going to their faces.
I think that there's been marketing tactics that's definitely like, in terms of young women spending power, it's like, I don't know how to say this. Like, you almost want to like stick it to the man. Like, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for me. I'm spending all this money on me and not my spouse or my future child. Like, because, you know, I've not been given much and I want to use my resources for me and myself. I'm investing in this $300 skincare device because I care about myself and I don't need anyone else to spend that money on me. And I think it comes definitely from a scarcity mindset. If I don't spend this on myself, no one else is going to spend it on me. I don't have the bandwidth, the mental bandwidth to spend that on other people. So it's really kind of a survival tactic.
And this youth obsession is a perfect example of how the scarcity loop feeds into our money. Because at the end of the day, you can't ever buy back age. In fact, time is the one completely finite resource that we have. But there will always be products sold to us in an attempt to approximate that. And the more we engage with it, the more we implicitly agree with the idea that our value is tied up in how young we are, or at least how young we look. In some ways, it's ironic that often young people are marketed this complete YOLO attitude about spending money and not thinking about the future while they're young because it's time they'll never get back. And at the same time as people age, especially women, they are relentlessly marketed the idea that if they can pay enough money, they can buy back their youth. Which is it, marketers? I call bullshit. But when it comes to the ways that scarcity and hyper-competition are marketed to us, few areas of our life have been more infiltrated than our work life. Which brings us to Chapter 4, Scarcity and Hustle Culture, the twin demons.
You gotta get up, you gotta get to work, you gotta get going.
My day is 6 a.m. to noon, and I'm not crazy. My second day starts at noon and goes till 6 p.m.
When you wake up, you gotta be hustling. You know, when I'm on a star climbing machine, I'm WhatsApping people, sending emails.
When we feel like there aren't enough opportunities to go around, whether or not this is true, it can keep us stuck in jobs that are not serving us, whether they are underpaying what we're worth or are outright toxic. And I want to be clear that for a lot of jobs, this can be true. We talked about this at length in our video about why everyone feels insane right now, but for many people, the job market is a really, really difficult place. That being said, it is not always the case, and especially for people who already have jobs, this perception of scarcity can push them away from even very basic things like negotiating for totally reasonable raises, or even exploring if there are other opportunities out there that might be a better fit than their current job. As we always say, the best time to be looking for a job is when you already have one. But that constant feedback loop of there isn't enough opportunity will often prevent us from doing that when it costs us nothing. And on average, only about half of people even negotiate at a job offer. Which, and I just want to say this once and for all, if an employer revokes an offer because you made a counter offer or attempted to negotiate, like, first of all, that's insane and only happens in very, very rare cases. It's completely standard practice to negotiate, but also a massive, massive, massive red flag and likely bullet dodged for that job. But that perception of scarcity will prevent us from ever advocating for ourselves, let alone for someone else. And when you combine it with an overwhelming hustle culture that teaches us that we are only as valuable as we are willing to burn up every other aspect of our lives, you see how easy it is to get stuck in these really toxic loops. Because hustle culture is deeply ingrained in the American psyche, particularly taking off with the glamorization of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs in the late 90s and early 2000s, which is around the same time when President Bill Clinton was famously getting 4 hours of sleep a night and bragging about it. And we often delude ourselves into thinking that just working more or giving ourselves the impression of working more, even if we're not actually working, means being more productive. Because there is a big productivity myth that ties in with scarcity. Scarcity means that we are always trying to optimize our lives, and it tricks us into believing that there's never enough time for things, that if we're not being productive or optimizing every waking moment, that we are wasting our precious life. In fact, from a psychological perspective, the number one thing that scarcity mindset does is remove our ability to even be in the present. Quote, the average American sleeps less than 6.5 hours a night, and the costs include not just much higher rates of illness, but also significantly worse performance. A comprehensive study by Ernst & Young showed that the longer the vacation their employees took, the better that they performed. Yet more than half of all Americans now fail to take all of their vacation days, and 30% of Americans use less than half of their allotted vacation time. Working more than 50 hours a week has been correlated in a raft of studies with less sleep, less physical activity, higher job dissatisfaction, and ultimately worse performance. And it has been consistently observed that the longer and more continuously people work, the less marginal return they get from each additional hour of work, and the more alienated and disengaged they become.
I think the way we look at hustle culture is that, hey, I want to get ahead. I don't have enough. And I think that feeling, yes, there is a level of scarcity mindset and I don't have enough, but like people truly are just not making enough. So they do need supplemental income to help survive. And that's where it can get really complicated, because once you start surviving, you could also be the victim of lifestyle and creep, right? Like the lifestyle increasing, which would tell you that you need to be working and making more money to be able to sustain that. So there is really a thin line between, hey, I'm not making enough and I need to hustle hard, but also this feeling of competitive nature, or like I'm better than other people because I'm sleeping less. I'm better than other people because I'm making more. I'm better than somebody else because I started my own business and now it's thriving. So we start to weave into like the nuances of, you know, humanity and psychology when we start talking about hustle culture, because then it starts being about, oh, this is who I am because I, you know, fill in the blank here, because I work harder, because I sleep less. And I think that is what really becomes toxic, is that we start looking at people who we deem quote unquote working less as being, you know, less serious or less successful.
Being in a religious family, you take pride in not having things of this world, quote. Like it says, like you need to be in the world, but not of this world. And we are here to, you know, be good Christians, but we are not to engage in worldly things like focusing and obsessing over money and growing your money when ultimately it's not going to help you in the end. So terms like investing for yourself, once you kind of hear how accessible it is to invest for your future and how people with generational wealth have been doing this for years and years and years, it really blew my mind, because I thought that everyone was just struggling. Like we're all just going to be struggling till the end of our days.
And while on its surface, this obsession with productivity and optimizing and maximizing every minute can seem like it's fundamentally oriented toward growth and abundance, it's actually the opposite. Not only is it robbing us of our precious free time for, as we see, very limited results, it also reinforces a culture where if we're not willing to work ourselves to burnout, someone else will be. Because let's be very clear, the hyper-competitive culture that America just generally vibes off of works to the direct benefit of corporate overlords. The more people are constantly fearing for their job or fearing for someone else's performance, the less concerned they're going to be with their own lives. And while we thought that we were maybe getting a reprieve from hustle culture with the post-pandemic rise in, quote, quiet quitting, with more people prioritizing personal lives over work, we've already seen a reversal of that trend. Gen Z may not be calling it rise and grind, but with an ever-looming recession on the horizon and the very real impacts of post-pandemic inflation, we're seeing more of them embrace the type of overworked professional life that so many claimed to not aspire to. Quote, the average college student expects to make $84,855 1 year after graduation, 52% more than the average starting salary of $55,911, according to one March survey of 1,000 undergrads. But those high salary expectations may be fueled by rampant inflation and anxiety. An overwhelming majority, 83% of graduating seniors, say that rising inflation and living costs are making them adjust their post-graduation plans, according to a recent survey of more than 2,000 recent college grads. One-day job and salary isn't enough, they say. While 70% plan to have a full-time job in the coming year, more than 9 in 10 expect to take on some form of side hustle, whether prompted to do so by inflation or other reasons.
It's a lot easier for us to blame ourselves, right? Like, just when we think about as systematic approach, it's a lot easier to blame yourself and say, I need to change versus the system needs to change. Because a system changing means, well, what do I, just me, just one vote matter to make a big system shift? But that is what needs to shift. It has to look, you have to start looking at, hey, it is not just me. This is a system problem that I'm not making enough. Why did I have to, list all the things you had to do to get this job, but I'm still not making enough? That is a problem. But especially in American culture, we are very individualistic and we like to place the blame on the individual, to tell them that they need to be better, that they need to work harder, as if it's some moral failing if you're not making enough money. It's a you problem versus like a us or a system-wide issue.
And I want to be very clear that none of this means that these aren't real economic factors that are leading people to behave this way. But in all of our lives, even with just some of the other stuff that we've discussed so far, there are ways that we can opt out of this hyper-competitive, hyper-individualist mindset, even if we don't necessarily have the luxury of doing it at the workplace. Because the truth is, when this scarcity mindset and this hyper-competition goes so unchecked, it leads to our final and perhaps most damning chapter, how scarcity gets votes. So we honestly can't talk about scarcity at all as an economic or a psychological concept without talking about how it is very intentionally used against us, in order to get us to vote against our own interest and in favor of the big business interests that benefit from our constant labor. Because let's face it, the root of the American scarcity mindset is our insistence on individualism. We are a selfish nation, as we are sold the idea that the nuclear family is more important than all else, which in turn leads to policy changes that are worse for families overall. The myth of scarcity ultimately keeps people voting against their own interests because it causes them to act out of fear rather than rationality. Quote, psychologists have studied decision-making within conditions of scarcity and found that scarcity consumes attention, working memory, and executive function, and elicits many counterproductive behavioral responses. In other words, when we perceive something to be scarce, we stop thinking rationally and our emotional brain takes over. We may find ourselves emotionally locked into obtaining the perceived scarce item and lose our sense of altruism and appear to focus only on our own self-interest. Ironically, in responding to these emotional reactions, we actually make our collective problem far worse. If we had stepped back to consider the situation from a calmer, more rational perspective, we would likely have concluded that the perception of scarcity was greater than the reality. And I think there's also often an additional phenomenon, which is a sense of, quite honestly, resentment. For example, the many people who oppose things like student loan forgiveness because they themselves had to pay their student loans. It's not technically an idea of scarcity, but it is that earlier concept we talked about, where the idea of someone else getting something is perceived as inherently taking something away from you, even if it isn't, because let's be clear, either way, you already paid your student loans.
If we all feel like we have this dog-eat-dog mentality, if we all have to fight over something, if we have to fight to survive, it does not lead a space for people to relax. It does not lead people to feel like, hey, rest is important. Rest is productive. It leads itself to, I need to work, hustle culture. I need to keep going. I need to push harder. I need to be the best. And that doesn't help anyone. Humans are collective, community-seeking creatures. But when we are pitted against each other, it's very easy to fall into this, oh, well, I only want to protect my own. I only want to protect the people who look or think like me. I only want to protect my community or be a part of that community, versus just being able to potentially even listen to what the other group is saying or what they also need. Because it could be exactly the same, but it is, it helps, certain people for us to fight each other versus fighting them. If we all decided, hey, we have a collective buying power that outweighs a smaller group that has more money, what would happen? But it gets, it gets a little manipulative is the word I'm looking for, when we start to think it is easier for us to be fighting amongst ourselves than to be fighting the bigger groups that may be making some of these decisions for us.
And that language of the millions of people who would stand to benefit from loan forgiveness not deserving it when other people worked so hard and sacrificed wasn't just stuff that people were saying on social media. It was very actively being used by people in positions of power to forgive those loans. Let's check in on human blobfish in a suit, Ted Cruz, and what he had to say about the student loan forgiveness plan. Quote, there is a real risk Okay guys, bear with me, I'm gonna do my Ted Cruz voice.
There is a real risk if you are that slacker barista who waited 7 years in college studying completely useless things, now has loans and can't get a job. Joe Biden just gave you 20 grand. Like, holy cow, 20 grand. You know, maybe you weren't gonna vote in November and suddenly you just got 20 grand.
I just like show me a more unlikable person than Ted Cruz. I know this isn't the overall point of this video, but just like every word out of his mouth is the most irritating word I've ever heard. But the point is the framing that there is something deeply offensive and more importantly, that takes away from you by someone else getting something, again, even if it changes nothing about your own situation, is a powerful psychological tool. And AOC correctly called this out for the scarcity mindset that it is. Quote, maybe student loan forgiveness doesn't impact you, but that doesn't make it bad. I'm sure that there are certainly other things that student loan borrowers' taxes pay for that you benefit from. We can do good things and reject the scarcity mindset that says doing something good for someone else comes at the cost of something for ourselves. And honestly, all of this conversation is not unlike demonic icon Ronald Reagan's capitalizing on the rampant racist myth of the welfare queen to the advantage of his rise in government. Because although the welfare queen myth has been debunked numerous times, and here's a link to an article that goes in depth on that, at its core it perpetuates an us versus them narrative, exploiting people's vulnerabilities and keeps people stuck in a scarcity mindset that makes them buy into racism and xenophobia because they feel like there's not enough resources to go around. And yet this often harms policies that would do a lot more good than harm, such as Medicare for All, which would theoretically save trillions of dollars of taxpayer money and have us ultimately spend a lot less per citizen on healthcare than we currently do.
My parents were missionaries in Korea, and they moved to England to become missionaries. And then I was there from ages 1 to 12. And then we moved to Minnesota and then New Jersey, and now I'm in Philly. It's really interesting kind of growing up in a Western society like the UK, where there were a lot of social safety nets for us. We were very low income, extremely low income as missionaries. There were still government safety nets for us. We had a lot of health scares when I was younger. And then coming to the US where, even though we are preaching this kind of community and we're at our core want to believe that, we are giving and we are fostering community, because the bigger system is the way it is, we can't really act in our best interest, in our community's best interest. We are just like in full survival mode.
And even looking at our most recent election cycle, we can see this phenomenon in action with immigration. So a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle have been leaning into anti-immigration rhetoric, claiming for the need to crack down on undocumented migrants to greater and lesser extents. Now, one theory for this being so successful is that when Americans perceive that the economy is in a downturn, they retreat into scarcity. Quote, when Americans feel good about their financial security and the health of the economy, they also feel good about immigrants and immigration. That's a lesson from the last few decades of Gallup polling. According to Jeff Jones, one of Gallup's data and public opinion experts, quote, we saw some declines around the Great Recession, favorable percentages were in the 50s, and then in 2018 and 2019, opinions were quite positive. In fact, both Republicans and Democrats were more positive about immigration during that time. But after the pandemic and its ensuing inflation and interest rate hikes, economic sentiment took a nosedive and anti-immigrant sentiment began to pick up as well. When asked whether immigrants have a positive or negative effect on job opportunities, taxes, or the economy in general, negative sentiment tended to increase in the lead up to the Great Recession, but then recovered after. A similar dynamic emerged before and after the pandemic. 43% of respondents said immigrants had a positive effect, while 31% said negative. But let's just look at the numbers, because quite frankly, and maybe I'm just triggered at the concept of polls here, but I am very, very sick of going off of people's vibes. At some point, we have to acknowledge that there are actual numbers, especially when it comes to something as urgent as immigration. Because when we look at immigration from a macroeconomic perspective, it is largely very good for the economy overall, which honestly should not even have to be a reason to not want 25 million people to be essentially deported overnight, but here we are. Quote, in 2022, immigrant households paid $579.1 billion in total taxes. That includes $35.1 billion in taxes paid by undocumented households. Immigrant households paid nearly 1 in every 6 tax dollars collected by federal, state, and local governments, helping to to fund a wide range of social services from public schools to food stamp programs and healthcare insurance for low-income families. Immigrants are playing a key role in keeping Medicaid and Social Security afloat. They paid $194.5 billion to Social Security, helping provide monthly benefits averaging $1,777 to over 100 million people and $53.6 billion to Medicaid in 2022. And yes, I am speaking as the proud wife of an immigrant who pays a ton in taxes and contributes so much to this economy, even though he was thrown out of the country for 2 years. He still loves this country, and honestly, we don't deserve it.
When it comes to money, when it comes to scarcity, when it comes to differences, communication is necessary. It's imperative for us to understand that we all are kind of searching for some level of commonality, but it's a lot easier to nitpick at how we are different. So taking the time to have those conversations about, hey, not judgmental, right? Like, I want everybody to back away from, well, they think this and this is what's going on there. I want people to really think about not judging each other and taking the time to allow somebody's viewpoints to be theirs and then to understand them, and then also not get defensive if somebody asked about it. So that you can have these open conversations with people about where they're coming from and why they're coming from, which allows you to realize that you may have more commonalities than not, and hopefully, push us towards a place where we're really caring about the general public versus just trying to sit in our silos of who we connect with most.
Ultimately, we talk a lot about a scarcity mindset as an individual thing that mostly just affects people who have experienced or are experiencing poverty. And there is truth to that. Again, that was personally my case for a very long time, and there are still ways on a day-to-day basis where I have to fight against some of my worst impulses, especially when it comes to things like future planning. But I think it's really important to take a much broader look at it, because scarcity is not just about an individual's experience with their own money. It's almost every aspect of the lives we live on a day-to-day basis in, again, our hyper-individualist, hyper-competitive culture. There is an underlying sentiment in almost every aspect of American life that says if you got something, then I inherently got less of it. Or that constantly tricks us into spending money on things we don't even really want or need. Or even that our own lives become less valuable with each subsequent day we live. As psychologist Lauren Alexander put it, a scarcity mindset does a great job of sucking the joy out of people's lives because everything starts to revolve around this thing that they don't have.
At the end of the day, it really is just about having these conversations, having the talk with your friends when you are feeling a little scarce, and then also moving out of the shame that comes up too. Because I think when we are living in a scarcity mindset, when we're having a really hard time believing that we will get there, believing that there is more or enough for us, we feel so isolated and so shameful when we don't have to, because there are other people who are going through the exact same thing too. So please talk about it.
There are ways in which we can't escape the reality of scarcity. For example, again, it is not in our minds that it is a very difficult job market for a lot of Americans, or that there is simply not enough money every month to buy the things that we need. But we all have some ways in which we can opt out of scarcity culture, at least in our own minds. Whether that means tuning out of things that are just going to upset you and send you on a comparison spiral on social media, or going out of your way to form communities that are about mutual advancement and not about competition, or just choosing to forgive yourself for not being in exactly the position you want to be at any given time. Like, I just can't keep reading articles about how if you don't have X or Y by age 30, you're basically a failure. Like, what's the goal there? Hun, like, what are we working towards with that, other than to make people feel even worse about themselves? Some scarcity is real, but a lot of it is manufactured, and we choose where we opt in. See you guys next month. Well, I guess next year. Happy holidays.